Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning somewhere in Estonia, one of the small Baltic nations on Russia's doorstep. You wake up to your phone blaring, not an alarm, an emergency alert, air sirens. Your neighbor is banging on the door. It happened. After Ukraine, Russia moved again. And NATO's Article 5, the guarantee that says an attack on one is an attack on all, is being tested for the first time in the alliance's 77-year history. That scenario sounds like fiction, but the world's top military analysts, NATO planners, and European governments are wargaming it for a real reason. Because right now, in March 2026, the Ukraine peace talks are stalling, Russia is launching its spring offensive, and a fragile world is holding its breath. Today, I'm going to tell you why what happens in Ukraine over the next 6 months might be the most consequential geopolitical event of your lifetime, and exactly how it will change your daily life if the wrong side wins. Where we are right now, 5 years of war and a stalled peace. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began February 24th, 2022. 5 years, hundreds of thousands of lives, and trillions of dollars later. The war is still raging. Over 1 million people have been killed. Ukraine controls roughly 80% of its pre-war territory. Russia occupies around 20%, including Crimea and large parts of eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. In early 2026, there was a brief window of hope. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner led 3 rounds of trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, Miami, and Geneva between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Trump had promised to end the war in 24 hours. That promise lasted about as long as most political promises. Here's where the talks broke down. Russia is demanding Ukraine formally withdraw from the Donbas, territory Ukraine still partially controls but which Russia claims. Ukraine says absolutely not. The U.S. appears to be quietly signaling it would accept Russia keeping what it already holds, in exchange for a security guarantee to prevent future invasion. Ukraine calls that a betrayal. Ukrainian soldiers on the front line have a blunter take. For this war to end, I think Putin probably has to die. Then on February 28th, the U.S. attacked Iran, and everything changed again. Trump's attention shifted dramatically to the Middle East. Peace talks went into what the Kremlin called a situational pause. Russia, meanwhile, launched its spring offensive, intensifying drone and missile attacks, including a massive strike using 392 drones in a single night. Russia is gaining from high oil prices caused by the Iran war, earning windfall revenues that finance its war machine. As one analyst put it, Russia is not just winning on the battlefield, it's winning the waiting game. What Russia winning actually means for Europe and for you. Let's be completely direct about what a Russian victory looks like and what it would mean for the world. A Russian win doesn't mean Putin plants a flag in Kyiv and calls it done. The more likely scenario is a frozen conflict deal in which Ukraine cedes large portions of its eastern territory and commits to permanent neutrality. No NATO membership ever. For Ukraine, analysts describe this as national humiliation and a death sentence for millions of Ukrainians living under Russian occupation. Reports from occupied territories describe forced deportations, cultural erasure, restrictions on the Ukrainian language, and what international human rights organizations call ethnic cleansing. But let's focus on what it means for you, whether you live in Berlin, London, Warsaw, New York, or Michigan. European Council on Foreign Relations analysts describe the consequence chain in chilling terms. Russia wins Ukraine. That signals to every authoritarian leader on the planet that territorial conquest works. China accelerates its pressure on Taiwan. North Korea grows more aggressive towards South Korea, and most dangerously, nuclear proliferation accelerates. Countries around the world watching Ukraine and watching the Middle East will draw one conclusion: the only guarantee of your sovereignty is a nuclear weapon. NATO planners are already warning that Russia could be positioned to challenge NATO territory by 2029. That's not a horror story to justify bigger defense budgets. That's a formal assessment. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are particularly vulnerable. They share borders with Russia or Russian ally Belarus. They have populations of fewer than 3 million each. And they are now spending 4 to 6% of their GDP on defense because they know they could be next. Europe's rearming, the $800 billion question. Here's a number that should stop you cold. $800 billion. That's how much additional defense spending European nations have committed to through the Rearm Europe plan. Money they intend to mobilize between now and 2030 to rebuild their militaries after decades of post-Cold War neglect. NATO agreed at its 2025 Hague summit that all members would spend 3.5% of GDP on direct defense, plus another 1.5% on defense infrastructure by 2035. That is a total of 5% of GDP. To put that in perspective, the US typically spends about 3.5% of GDP on defense. Europe is now committed to matching or exceeding that level. Germany alone has committed to spending up to 500 billion euros on defense by the mid-2030s. Lithuania plans to spend 5 to 6% of GDP on defense through 2030. Denmark is buying more F-35s. The Netherlands is expanding its military from 70,000 to 200,000 personnel. Poland, which shares a border with both Russia and Russian ally Belarus, is already spending more than 4% of GDP, the highest in NATO. What does this mean for everyday Europeans? It means governments are redirecting money. Money that used to go to social programs, healthcare, education, and infrastructure is now flowing into defense budgets. The EU has even created a 150 billion euro emergency loan fund, called the Security Action for Europe, or SAFE, to let nations borrow specifically for military purchases. France and the UK are planning to establish military hubs inside Ukraine as part of any eventual peace deal, a permanent military presence. And America? Trump has spent much of his second term demanding Europe pay for its own defense, a message that European leaders, ironically, have finally started acting on. But here's the dark irony. The very uncertainty Trump created about whether the US would honor Article 5, the NATO Mutual Defense Guarantee, is what forced Europe into this trillion-dollar rearmament. One German official noted that France is now watching Germany's military buildup with something that can only be described as anxiety. Europe is rearming so fast that its own members are worried about the power shifts it will create. The human cost. What a bad peace deal looks like. Let's talk about the human dimension of this, because geopolitics can sound abstract until you meet the people living it. More than 3.5 million Ukrainians are living under Russian occupation right now. What does that look like? Ukrainian men in occupied territories have been forced into Russian military service or imprisoned. Women have been subjected to systematic sexual violence, documented by international investigators and included in war crimes proceedings at the International Criminal Court. Children have been deported to Russia in what Ukraine and its Western allies call forced Russification, removing them from their families and culture to raise them as Russian citizens. Ukraine's archives, libraries, universities, and cultural institutions have been systematically destroyed in an effort to erase Ukrainian identity. A peace deal that freezes these realities in place isn't peace. It's a ceasefire that entrenches atrocities. And the history of frozen conflicts, Kosovo, Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, shows that they don't stay frozen, they reignite. Recent polling from Ukraine by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology shows a striking shift. 64% of Ukrainians now say they could accept a peace deal that gives up some territory, provided they get EU and NATO membership for the territory they keep. 6 months ago, that number was 47%. This is the face of a society that is exhausted, but also deeply aware that a bad deal is worse than a long war. And those Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, they're still fighting. They believe, with everything they have, that ceding ground just invites the next invasion. The domino no one wants to say out loud. Here's the domino that virtually every serious analyst is afraid to say out loud, but is absolutely saying in private. If Russia wins in Ukraine, nuclear proliferation becomes the defining crisis of the 2030s. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 under the Budapest Memorandum, in exchange for sovereignty guarantees from Russia, the US, and the UK. How's that working out? Every government in the world that doesn't have nukes is watching Ukraine and drawing the only logical conclusion. A piece of paper isn't protection, only a bomb is. Countries like South Korea, Japan, Poland, and even Saudi Arabia are now part of serious academic and policy conversations about whether they should pursue nuclear capabilities. If even 2 or 3 countries in the next decade cross that threshold, the entire architecture of nuclear non-proliferation that has kept the world from nuclear war for 70 years begins to crack. And a world with 10 nuclear powers instead of 9 is exponentially more dangerous than one with 9. This is the real stakes of the Ukraine war. It's not just about who controls Donetsk or Luhansk. It's about whether the international rules that say you can't conquer your neighbors by force actually have any teeth. Because if they don't, if Russia wins and faces no real consequences, every potential aggressor in the world gets the same message at the same time. Why this affects your life? So here's the bottom line. Why does the Ukraine war matter to you? It matters because a more dangerous Europe means your government spends more on defense and less on everything else. It matters because instability in Europe disrupts global supply chains. Grain from Ukraine feeds hundreds of millions of people across Africa and the Middle East. It matters because Russian disinformation and hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, election interference, propaganda are already operating in your country, in your social media feed, shaping what you believe is true. And it matters because the precedent set here will govern how China handles Taiwan, how North Korea handles the Korean Peninsula, and how every strongman who wants his neighbor's territory calculates whether the world will stop him. The war in Ukraine is not a faraway conflict. It is a stress test of the rules-based international order and whether it survives. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this shapes your world. Comment below. Do you think Ukraine should take a peace deal now or hold out? I genuinely want to hear your perspective.